Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue, and I am playing around with Sculptron 1.0. Sculptron is OTOY's sculpting app. They just released a 1.0 version, and I believe you can get it for free or just go over and download it if you have any of the various subscriptions to Octane. And I'll put a link down in the description for that. So yeah, it's a sculpting app. It has all kinds of sculpting tools. But what's really interesting about this application, and what's really struck me, is that I think it should be considered a deformation application, not a sculpting application. It has all of these deformation tools here. And the idea behind it is you can bring in your data, whether that's polygonal data or even volumetric data, do a variety of deformation effects to it, whether that be sculpting or adding any of these deformation effects over here, and you bring them into this deformation stack, which is an order of operations stack. And that's really what this video is going to be about, is understanding the order of operations deformation stack in Sculptron, because I think that's where this program is probably heading, is a program that allows you to bring in data, whether, again, like I said, it's polygonal data with a vertex cache or not, or even volumetric data, and then sculpting on it, applying your vertex cache and modifying it with sculpting tools, or using any of these other deformation tools over here, including things like delta mush and smooth, which helps, which I'll get to as well, which helps smooth out some of your deformations. And then exporting that data back out as a vertex cache or an OBJ sequence or a VDB sequence or just a VDB file. The VDB files and sequences are the volumetric data you may get from a Embergen simulation or something from Houdini or something like that. Really, it's a standard volumetric format that any program nowadays will support. And yeah, like I said, I think that's where it's going. So it's really key to understand the deformation stack here and how order of operations deformations work, and to really get the most out of this program. So that's where I'm going to go. I'm not really going to get into the sculpting tools here, which, like I said, are fine, but I think we've all kind of seen these sculpting tools. One thing I will say is it's like just insanely fast. So speed-wise, we're looking at true polygon sculpting, and it is just super fast. But let's talk about the deformation stack. And I'm going to use Moto as an example here, because Moto also has an order of operations deformation stack that is very similar to Sculptron. So this is a great white shark that my company made in Moto, and it's got a animation sequence on here. So there's a number of deformers, some sort of basic skeleton joint based deformation on him, as well as some bend deformers on there for the fins and things like that. And like I said, Moto also has a deformation stack. So we have this deformation stack over here where I've got here's our skeletal deformation. There's some different bend deformers on the tails and fins and stuff like that. You can see the weight maps that these different bends affect, right? So it's pretty cool how that works in Moto. And if you're a Moto user, you probably understand this deformation stack pretty well. In Sculptron, though, we've got the same sort of feature. So I can bring this shark and all the animation that has already been done to it into Sculptron, and I do that by exporting an MDD. So in Moto, you would just have the shark selected here. And the shark's name is Avalon, by the way. It's actually a real great white shark named Avalon that is an animation I did for an aquarium that was studying these things off the Farallon Islands in California. So this is actually the same dimensions as a real, and actually the same texture. This is the same sort of markings that actually this real shark named Avalon had, which is kind of interesting if you are into sharks like me. So anyway, so that's the shark, but I would just select it here and go over to animate, and I can export an MDD. So MDD is sort of an older Vertex Cache format. So what it'll do is it'll go through every single vertex in this mesh, and it'll save a position for each one of these guys, and for each frame. So they can be pretty big files, and it'll stream that in on a frame by frame basis. And now there's more sort of modern vertex caches like Alembic that I think stream in a little faster than MDD. And we'll get back to this because I hope to see Sculptron support Alembic as well, or Alembic, as some people say it, in the future. So back here in Sculptron, I can import my geometry. So under the little import tab here, click object. Right now it just does OBJs. So I'll select my Avalon Shark OBJ. Hopefully we'll see, again, Alembic and FBX or something in the future, because we'll get to this in a minute. I think that you can take advantage of weight map data in FBX files to help drive some of these deformers, but I'll talk about that in a second. So let's just change this general material here. You get a material item in the scene when you bring in your geometry, and you can drag in textures and stuff like that, but I'll just turn those into sort of a ZBrushy looking sculpting material. And these materials are PBRs, so it's really forward thinking of the developers to sort of put in this PBR type material with slots for albedo and metallic texture and specular, all that you would get from something like Substance or Pixel Bridge. And okay, so we've got our shark here. So let's start deforming it. I'll look at the deform effects here, and there's a bunch of them. If I select my shark object here in the outliner, I can see that these are now active. Vertex Cache will be our MDD cache that we just saved out. I'll get to that in a minute. And sculpt layer adds, obviously a layer for sculpting. But we also have these other deformers. We have a transform deformer, which is sort of a basic move, scale, rotate deformer if you want to move, scale, rotate portions of your mesh around. And then the rest of these should just be familiar to any other, if you've used any other 3D program. Bend, taper, twist. Smooth and delta mush are really useful for smoothing out deformations. I'll get to those in a second. And then spherify and ripple. So let's just keep this simple. I'll add a spherify effect here, and you can see we've now have a deformation stack object in our outliner with a spherify effect parented underneath it. And now we've got this spherify effect affecting our shark in the scene here. And there's a bunch of channels, and you also see this spherify ref item added. Now I'll talk about this as well. So the spherify deformer doesn't have its own transform channels, meaning it references this locator or null object to get its position and scale and rotation in the scene. So if I want to move this effect, let's say to the head or the tail, I move the spherify ref item, this null object here. And with it selected, I can either just drag in the attribute editor here for the position, or if I click, instead of my selection tool, I click my transform tool, I'll get some handles here and I can move these around. And so again, if you look at the position Z here, that channel value right here, and if I select my spherify deformer, I'll see this spherify ref tab here or drop down. And I've got all my spherify ref channels here, even though my spherify deformer is selected. You can see that there's my Z channels. I can change that to put it back to 0. That's just for convenience. So it's nice to have not have to just keep selecting. If I want to change the position, not have to deselect my spherify deformer and then select my ref and change the position, then go back here and select that. It just adds those channels here. One thing that's maybe a little confusing though is this transform tool no longer works. So if I try to transform this with the tool, nothing is happening with this selected. So it seems like, I don't know if that's a bug or just an oversight, but really if I have this deformer selected and I can see its reference or null objects channels here, if I have the transform tool active, I should be able to move it. I shouldn't have to just pick this and now move it around. I should just be able to use this transform tool with this selected. So just a little thing there, if it's a little bit confusing for you. Anyway, so I'm going to move this back over to the tail, and then I'm going to shrink down the effect a little bit. So let's just shrink down our radius. By the way, I'm so happy that these little mini sliders work up, down, and left, right, because a lot of us use a stylus. And when you're really close to the edge here, you don't want to just drag left, right, because you'll often go over the edge of the application, or the edge of your, I'm sorry, not the edge of the application, but the edge of your actual Wacom tablet. So, okay, so we've got a bit of a bulge here in the tail. Great. Now let's take a look at the Vertex Cache, and we'll see how this deformation stack works here in terms of the order of operations. So I'm going to click my Vertex Cache here, and it's going to bring up a requester, and I can bring in my Avalon MDD file I saved from Moto and pull that in. And the first thing you'll notice is that it's sort of flipped, right? So I have some options here, and this isn't uncommon. So depending on which application you use, you may have a flipped transforms on your vertices. So I can just flip it back real quick by clicking Flip Z. Puts everything right in the universe again. And yeah, so again, I've got an influence or an amount. So these do the same thing, influence or amount on here. All deformers have this influence on it, and they can be animated as well. But what I want to see is what happens in the deformation stack if I change the order of operations by dragging these, right? So if I go like this, let me just sort of change my viewport here, and I can turn off both the visibility and the effect of these in the deformation stack. So if I don't want to see this purple spherify deformer, I can just turn off the visibility of it, and I can turn it back on. But I can also turn the effect off completely by hitting the check mark. So right now the effect is off, and I'm just getting the Avalon MDD. And so you're seeing this nice smooth swimming effect here. And by the way, Sculptron is just super fast. So I can play this in real time here. This is 30 frames per second, but I could probably crank this up to 100 frames per second and it's no problem. It's just a really, really nice and fast deformation system they've got going on here. So if I turn the spherify effect back on, now we talk about this for a minute, the deformation stack goes from top to bottom. So Avalon will be, this MDD will be applied first, and then the spherify will be applied. That's different from Moto, where it's bottom up, where in Moto, the deformation stack is bottom up. The first thing you apply gets, the spherify gets applied first, and then the Avalon gets on top of that. So, but that's Moto. So just saying, if you're a Moto user, this is the opposite. It's top down. So Avalon, the MDD gets applied first, and then the spherify effect. And what you're seeing happen here is the spherify effect is being applied second. So every time this tail swooshes through the MDD vertex deformer, brings it through that purple influence radius of the spherify effect, you see the spherify effect happening. That's not really what we'd want. What we'd want to happen is the spherify effect to happen first. So let me just turn off the vertex cache. So this will happen first while this shark is in its rest pose, so to speak. The tail gets ballooned out, and then we apply the swimming motion. So we get to keep that ballooning effect, right? So as it's going in and out of that purple circle there, purple sphere, we keep that ballooning effect from the spherify effect because it's happening first. So again, this is an order of operations feature. This is why order of operations are so powerful. You just layer these on top of each other. And then of course you can just, affect the influence and crank them up and down like, Photoshop layers, it's almost like a transparency effect, or it's exactly like a transparency effect, not almost like one. So again, pretty powerful, right? So we can do sort of this sphere deformation first on a rest pose, and then bring in our vertex cache, and that sphere deformation goes along for the ride. And then if I want to get rid of some of these sort of sharp angles here, I could throw on a delta mush at the end of the day. So spherify gets applied first, then the vertex cache. Now a delta mush, you see what delta mush does? It's just sort of a magical smooth everything out feature. And I can, again, turn this down a little bit. I'm not really sure what the difference between the tangent space setup is between simple and axis. I may have to, we'll probably have to ask on the OTOY forums and get the developers to chime in what that does. But what it does in general is it does a nice smoothing effect. So I can turn off the delta mush. You can see there's a pretty sharp deformation there. If I turn it back on, it smooths that out. And of course, I can knock down the influence a little bit if I want to, or crank it back up to 100. Pretty cool. You'll also notice that the delta mush only affects the area that's being deformed. So it's sort of a smart deformer where it looks at the mesh, it sees areas that are being deformed, and smooths those out. If I turn it off and add a smooth deformer here. Now, I think this is a bit of a bug. When you first add smooth, your entire mesh shrinks down, but let me just sort of adjust the influence a little bit here. Yeah, so now it comes back up. So let me just turn that up to like 100% and maybe like 10 iterations. You'll see that smoothing out the entire mesh, right? It smoothed out my gills and the face and everything else. Not really what I want. Now, smooth can have there are definitely situations where you're probably going to want that, but that's not the case here. What we want is we really just want to smooth out this area that's being deformed here, and that's where delta mush comes in. So again, a really sort of like a it's not one-click magic, but it's super useful in smoothing out those bendy parts of joint animations and things like that, where you need to just round off the harsh corners of your deformation. So anyway, that's how this order of operations stack works in general. Let me just do one more example here. We'll do some sculpting. So let me go back to Moto. So here I am with this cat geometry, and it's all rigged up with Auto Character System 3's default quadruped rig. Now, Auto Character System 3, by the way, whether you use Moto or not, it's just a fantastic rigging solution, and also has some really nice animation tools as well. What I did is I just brought in the default quadruped rig and gave it a few more spine segments and fit it to the cat and did like some super awesome Pixar-worthy animation here of it doing this sort of little thing there. So Moto, of course, like I said, has its own order of operations deformation system, and you can even apply modeling operations to the stack here. So here I've got this animation happening first, and then I can apply like a subdivide to the mesh like this. So you can click those on and off. And so yeah, Moto is super powerful because it integrates modeling tools with this whole order of operations system. So you can model and rig in an order of operations system. And here I'm just subdividing it post post animation, and I can export this out as an MDD and bring this whole thing into Sculptron as well. So I'll do that. And there's my cat OBJ. And again, let me just change the default material. You can also change the HDR used in this with the environment setting here. You can just change out the default HDR if you want to. I'll just keep it for now, but where's my roughness? Roughen that up a bit. Okay, looks good. And yeah, you can turn off the grid up here as well if you want to turn off the grid visibility. And then I'm going to bring in my MDD I had saved out earlier with my Vertex Cache. So I got my cat MDD, and we'll flip it on the Z-axis like normal. And then I can just scrub through here. And again, it's just super fast. Like plays super fast. I almost wonder, let's see how fast I can get this going. Playback is 30. Let's put it like 300. I'm just curious that it'll actually work. Yeah, it does. It's just like, yeah, it's super fast. Sculptron, if anything, like anything OTOY does, it just leverages your GPU like crazy. Granted, I've got a 3090 in this system, but it's just super fast. So here we go. And let's look at these sculpting tools here. So I've got this silly little cat animation. Let's say I want to sculpt out some bone and muscle stuff on this guy. I don't actually have a ton of geometry to work with here. And one thing I'd really like to see, here, I'll turn on wireframe mode so you can see the wireframe here. I would love to see some sort of subdivide operator in the deformation stack, kind of like I just showed in Moto. It's subdivide is not deform; it's a geometric sort of operation. So I don't know if that's something Sculptron can do, but I'm guessing, it will be able to. I mean, it just seems like the logical extension of what they're trying to do here. Again, is being able to bring in any sort of data and up the resolution, or whatever, and do some sculpting on it or do some deformation effects. So anyway, let's just add a sculpt deformer. So I can click sculpt layer, or actually if I just click my sculpting tools here, it'll add it for me. That's just another way to do it. And then if I want to animate this, I want to go down here to my sculpt layer and click on this little curve here, which will add a keyframe for the morph. And the morph is where you animate your sculpts throughout every frame. So for instance, right now, if I just sculpt like this and then scrub my animation, that little bump I just sculpt will be on every single frame. But if I click my morph here, I now am going to get a keyframe down here. You see right there, the little yellow keyframe. And if I pull forward and sculpt a little more, I get another keyframe. Pull forward, maybe I want to smooth that out and sculpt over here, get another keyframe. And you'll see how that's changing over time. And right away, the speed of this and the sculpting tools and being able to keyframe them and just scrub through in real time becomes super obvious, super fast how useful of a tool this will be, right? So let me delete these here, just right click and delete these keys and delete this one. So I've got my sort of baseline keyframe right here, and then I'm going to sculpt some animation here. So when he bends down like this, I think this is a symmetrical mesh. So let me turn on X symmetry and see if that works. Let's get some shoulder blades here. Yeah, so I've got some shoulder blades sculpting out here and some hips sort of sculpting out here. Let me just turn off the wireframe maybe. I don't know if that'll make it seem better or worse, but yes, okay. So maybe that's, maybe my hips, let me just smooth those out. Maybe they need to be a little more here than there, but this isn't probably going to be the best sculpting you've ever seen before, but smooth that out just a little bit. And so again, I'm cat's going into this pose right here, and you see some bones and muscles starting to flex. Maybe gets a little bit of little muscle there and a little muscle here. And so kind of see that happening, right? Actually, let me delete this keyframe. I want to put it on this one. So a little bit of a muscle here and a little bit of a muscle here, right? Maybe a little bit of a little neck muscle coming in. Our cat is just buff. So anyway, there it goes, right? Pretty sweet. And then I can come over, when it comes back up, maybe add another keyframe here. I can either just do a little bit of sculpting, or I should just be able to actually right click and create key as well if you want to create a key there. And then we'll go back up to 120. And can I copy and paste keys, right click? I don't think I can yet. So in fact, there is no graph editor on this. And again, I suspect because this is really a deformation program, more than just like a sculpting program, that we're going to see a sort of Maya Moto sort of style graph editor, a Cinema 4D type graph editor here. We can edit the curves directly. I would hope we can see that eventually. Right now, we can sort of right click and affect the interpolation, sort of like a smooth linear stepped. But obviously what we want is a full-blown graph editor. What I could do, I think, is use one of these other sculpting tools. There's a restore tool. Yeah, here, if I click restore and right click and make my mouse bigger and just restore these sculpts to their original neck muscles, original shape there, then I'll get what I want. So, here I am, just a couple seconds of sculpting, and I've got a little bit of a fake muscle animation with my cat. Now, is this as good as a muscle system? I don't know, probably not. But did I do it in like a minute? Yes, I did. So, and I just see the I'm not running a simulation. I just scrub through here and see the feedback instantaneously. So it's really pretty amazing what this program can do. And you can do all this type of stuff with volumetrics as well. So that's probably another video because this is pretty long, but you get an idea of what Sculptron can do as an animation or a deformation system, right? Not so much a sculpting system. Sculpting is just one of the tools you have, but this is a full-blown deformation system with an order of operations deformation stack. Now, what I'd really love to be able to see it do is bring in, let's say, FBX files where I can bring in weight maps, kind of like I showed earlier. If I go back to Moto and select some of these joints here, you'll see these weight maps, right? Where, the influence of these joints on the mesh. And I'd love those to come in with an FBX file that I import into Sculptron, because I'd like the bend to just affect the tail. And I'd like essentially an option. And if I add a bend deformer here, I'd like an option here in bend to pick a vertex map that is built into the geometry, rather than just relying on this bend reference object, which I might be able to screw around and get it to sort of only do the tail if I put it over here and move it into position like so. Whoops, again, this is that bug where I have the transform active and I have just the bend deformer active. I don't actually move the bend reference object. So again, I'd like to see that sort of oversight fixed. But let me put this in a position here, and then I need to rotate it around to just affect the tail here. And then if I actually do the bending with the bend angle, here I'm bending the entire cat. And I just wanted to limit it to the tail. And I don't think there's a way on the current bend deformer to just change the pivot of the actual bend effect, or to limit it to just one side of the axis. So again, if I could select a vertex map to be bent on the geometry with any of these deformers here, that would be fantastic. And again, this is the type of stuff where I kind of expect to see that. I don't know if it will. Maybe we can do an interview with Lino, who's the head developer on this, and see where this is going maybe. But that kind of thing would just add to this super fast deformation system here and give us more control where we put these deformers. So just to wrap up, because I could screw around with this forever, just a really cool, super fast deformation application. It has fantastic sculpting deformation tools. And of course, you don't have to animate it. You can just sculpt regular meshes. But there's other programs that can do that. And what this program can do that other programs really can't, or at least not as fast, is this whole order of operations deformation system. And I can't stress how much order of operations is important. And being able to mix standard deformations with vertex caches and mix sculpting with vertex caches as well, and then spitting it back out as a new vertex cache is pretty amazing. So maybe I'll tackle VDBs next, but again, check this out if you have an Octane subscription. Really impressed with where this program is going.
Yum, yum!